And how do I advance this?
Yeah, that is
Just
the
so
right
I
one.
know.
I'm going to steal these. But yeah, just
Okay,
the
great.
big green one. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so I just want to echo Ursula's thanks. It's really such an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for Paola for the invitation. And I also want to acknowledge that the conference is taking place on Lenape and Haudenosaunee territory, and that with this acknowledgement, and that also it's now home to a range of indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island and beyond. And with this acknowledgement as a kind of a reminder to myself and a sort of an asking from you, my community, to really hold us accountable to the questions of the ongoing project of decolonization. And you'll see that this is really important to me in my thinking, so this is part of the reason why I always begin with this kind of a territorial acknowledgement. So one of the things that I've been thinking about for a long time is the relationship of how do we think about the Anthropocene in relationship to questions of art and design. And one of the ways in which I've been conceiving of this, and specifically in the book of that title that I edited with Etienne Turpin a few years ago, is that we argued in that book that the Anthropocene, if we are to accept this term and its mobilizing potentials, and there's all kinds of problems with that term itself, but I think that one of the useful things about that term is that it does this grouping of many different ecological issues together, and so for that I think it's still useful, and also as you'll see a bit later, what I'm going to talk about is that also I think that the Anthropocene betrays, in its naming, it betrays something fundamental about our current relationship with the wider environment. So we argue in that book that the Anthropocene is an aesthetic event. And so what do we mean by that? First of all, we mean this in the sense of aesthesis, right? So that the Anthropocene is a fundamental rearrangement of both the human and other kinds of sensorium. And it's doing this, not to say that this hasn't been happened in numerous other points in planetary history, but rather that it's happening at a scale and at a pace that is really kind of fundamentally unprecedented. And so thinking about this in these terms, I think really helps us take into account the ways in which the Anthropocene is primarily a perceptive and embodied experience, right? And it marks the period of complete defamiliarization and derangement of sense perception. And we can see this unfolding around us all the time, right? So it's a complete transformation of the sensations and the qualities of the world. And in other words, the worlds that we are born into are receding in front of our eyes, right? Causing a complete kind of rearrangement of the sensory apparatus of our organisms. So these are the kinds of questions that I'm really interested in relationship to the Anthropocene. And that climate change under these terms can really be thought of as this kind of rearrangement. And we can think of this in terms of these kinds of unintentional aesthetic events, such as the intensification of sunsets because of the particulate matter in the atmosphere. And we can think of this in terms of how Nicholas Mirzoff characterizes the Anthropocene as the deadening of the sensations, right? So he says that a lot of the kinds of aesthetics that we see in relationship to art practices, and specifically in relationship to some of the older art practices, actually are enacting a kind of anesthetization. So are getting used to, even Ursula's example of the car commercial, what in part that's doing is an anesthetization to the complete rearrangement of the sensory apparatus that we are now having to undergo. And what I would say about this is that not only is this kind of complete sort of rearrangement of the senses, but it's a rearrangement of the senses within a very specific type of logic. And as I've argued with my colleague Zoe Todd, a Métis anthropologist, what we argue there is that the rearrangement of the senses that is happening is undergoing through the colonial lens. And so actually the Anthropocene is really the extension and enactment of colonial logic, because it systematically erases difference, right? And we can see this in all kinds of examples, and we can see this primarily through the project of settler colonialism, where the actual project of it was the goal and aim of settler colonialism was to change the climate, right? It was to come to these lands or to other lands and to literally remake the world into the vision of a displaced Europe. And so this happened throughout the last 500 years through this kind of radical transformation of the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and other kinds of ecological systems. And obviously, then we can also see that in terms of Lewis and Maslin's article, in case you're unfamiliar with it, where they argue that the Anthropocene should be dated to the beginning of the colonial period, so to 1610, the Orbis spike. And in part, they argue this because you can actually see in the geologic record the marker of the the decrease in carbon dioxide levels because of the fact of genocide, right? So there were so many people, 90% of the population of the Americas was killed off was brutally murdered through the project of colonialism. And due to these factors, you can actually see the regrowth of forests and therefore the decrease in carbon dioxide. And what we argue, myself and Zoe Todd, is that these kinds of universalist ideas are still deeply embedded in the ways in which we approach conventionally in the West, at least, and more globally, we approach these kinds of concepts of what it means to be living in an ecology. And even the term Anthropocene itself, with its same kind of universalizing tendencies, betrays the same logic, right? It extends and betrays the same logic that where colonizers actively shaped territories and refused to see what was in front of them, instead forcing a landscape, climate, flora, and fauna into an idealized version of the world modeled on sameness and replication of the homeland. So the seismic shock of dispossession and brutality that colonialism employed to gain entry into and claims over indigenous lands in the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, this seismic shock kept rolling like a slinky, pressing and compacting in different ways in different places as colonialism spread outwards into homelands of self-determining peoples around the globe. And the other thing I want to say about this is that this process of climate change as the means and aim of colonialism is not incidental, right? And just in the sense of wanting to remake the kind of aesthetic experience of a place, but is also a fundamentally effective strategy at gaining power over other peoples, right? If you completely reshape the homelands of peoples, you can really undermine their ability to be sovereign, right? And so this was an incredibly effective strategy that worked to compact and speed up time, laying waste to legal orders, languages, and place story in quick succession. The fleshy, violent loss of 50 million indigenous peoples in the Americas is something that myself and Todd read as a quickening of space-time in a seismic sense. The seismic shock of genocide met with another one, that of the Middle Passage, again premised on a logic of extraction and violence. So Christina Sharp describes the ongoing reverberations of chattel slavery and the rending of life worlds in the wake of the ships and ideologies that transported captured Africans across the Atlantic. Sharp teaches us that in the wake, the past is not the past. The past that is not past reappears always to rupture the present. Building on her work, we can gesture to how the entangled viciousness of capital and white supremacy have their direct roots in the epistemic violence of discovery, dispossession, extraction, and the horrific capture of life, bodies, and worlds. The notion of the Anthropocene as disaster in dominant scientific and social science discourses must tend to the ongoing disaster of the Middle Passage and settler colonialism if we're really going to get anywhere, even if that anywhere is towards a more graceful extinction. This seismic shockwave has rolled through and across space and time and is now hitting those nations' legal systems and structures that brought about the rending and disruption of life worlds and lifeways in the first place. So what do we do with this kind of paradigm? How do we think about, I was really intrigued with the framing of this as a kind of reparative or restorative design practice, right? Because, when we think of reparations, at least within the context of North America, we often think of reparations in relationship to questions of slavery or in questions of indigenous dispossession and various, and genocide and various mechanisms. Where I'm from in Canada, there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, for example, and reparations were literally paid out by the government in the form of thousands and thousands of dollars to individuals and to tribal nations. So how do we think about reparations if in fact, our sensory apparatuses have been completely rearranged through the mechanisms of colonial logics, right? If the worlds and sensations that we inhabit are embedded in these, in our perceptive abilities, are embedded in a kind of colonialism. And one of the things that I've been really thinking with, or really caught by, is Eve Tuck and Steve Ree's notion of haunting. And they describe two different sort of mechanisms. They look at Japanese and American horror films and really look at the ways in which haunting is figured in these two different kind of genres. And in American horror films, there's always an innocent hero that's being invaded by some kind of monster or, specter or whatever, or ghost, and that in the process of the storytelling, they somehow kill off the monster or the ghost, and then it goes away, right? Rather, in Japanese horror films, they say that because the depth of injustice that begat the monster or ghost is acknowledged, the hero does not think of herself to be innocent or try to achieve reconciliation or healing, only mercy in the form of passing on a debt. And they go on to say, haunting lies precisely in its refusal to stop. Alien to settlers and generative for ghosts, this refusal to stop is its own form of resolving. For ghosts, the haunting is the resolving. It is not what needs to be resolved. And so the question that I want sort of to put out there, and I don't really have an answer to this myself, but is really how do we really think through this question of haunting, right? How do we actually come to grapple with the fact that some of these injustices simply cannot be repaired? Right? How do we, and I think that, and the reason why I propose this is because I think that in a lot of sort of mainstream approaches to questions of climate change and to questions of climate change and design, what is often immediately gotten to is this moment of technological fix, right? And what I want to say is, what if we actually just sit with brokenness? What if brokenness, in fact, is a way to move through with grace towards this kind of inevitable extinction that will, in fact, lead us to a more reparative moment? That's what I'm going to say.
Hi, I'm Chris Woebken, co-founder of the Extrapolation Factory. Our practice was established on the premise that writing stories and holding conversations about futures are important social activities that should be actively shaped by communities. Historically, futures-oriented visions have depicted corporate and top-down scenarios, but rarely, if ever, have asked individuals what they want their futures to be like. My practice has been researching ways to help non-futurists engage and explore these tools through design. My goal is to empower people to envision their own preferred futures and the roads that lead to those visions. A project called Transition Habitats helps the public to listen to non-human indicator species and then interpret their messages as proposals for futures. We started by asking the public to reimagine parts of the urban infrastructure in ways that would serve human and non-human needs. In an effort to filter and develop a vast list of concepts, we shared the ideas with a community of biologists and ecologists to garner expert feedback and to evolve these concepts. We resolved the project in the Walker Art Center garden by deploying an interspecies postal service system that allows for the interpretation of the monitored data of non-human inhabitants as postcards to be sent to local politicians. What messages would a non-human organism send to a decision maker? If a non-human individual messaged a politician, would they be considered a constituent? How could the nation's communication infrastructure be redesigned to serve non-human organisms? These are the monarch and migrating bird mailboxes that allow for monitoring changes in the monarch morphology and for studying bird migration patterns. Here's the lichen mailbox that's monitoring air quality through measuring the lichen diversity growing on the rock. I believe that participatory futures have the potential to seed restorative design narratives and to support navigating towards preferable relationships with our ecosystems.
Paula, thank you for your kind and gracious invitation, and thanks also to Ala and Erica for the incredible hospitality in inviting me. My name is Karthik Dinakar. I'm a statistician and computer scientist. I research artificial intelligence. And the project that I'm going to be talking about today is called cardiolinguistics. These are my collaborators, Catherine Kretsulas, who leads the study from Harvard. And when I read Paula's essay on reparations with design, as a machine learning researcher, I think it's pretty instructive to look at some inspiring examples. So this one is from astrophysics. When we look at a beautiful image of a far-flung galaxy, we realize that light, when we actually look back into the past, because light has taken all this while to travel this distance from the source to the observer, and when it travels this distance, it is always traveling through areas where there's intense gravitational fields because of celestial objects that lie between. And the image that we see as an observer is usually one that's distorted. And this phenomenon is called gravitational lensing, something popularized by Albert Einstein in 1912. And astrophysics, they apply what's called a gravitational lens corrector. So as a machine learning individual, when we apply statistics on basically learning from historical data, we have to be pretty careful in what that data set actually represents. So this is an example of light traveling an enormous distance, but it looks like there's a black hole in between that has all this gravitational mass, and the image that we see in the end is not actually what the original star or nebula actually portrays. Now, the topic of my talk is cardiolinguistics, and globally, cardiovascular disease is often thought to be a male killer. This is the predominant stereotype, but it's actually the #1 killer for women. This is the official statement from the World Health Organization. So the question becomes, why is it often thought to be a man's disease? Cardiovascular disease, the mortality trends in Canada and the United States, more people die of heart disease the world over, actually, not just in North America. With heart disease compared to other diseases, this one is saying, this one compares heart disease deaths to those with cancer. It is also one of the most mature disciplines in medicine with one of the best outcomes over the years. In fact, more than 60% of all literature published in medicine is in cardiology. And the number of deaths due to heart disease have impressively been going down year after year thanks to improvements in medicine. But as I said earlier, more women die of heart disease than men do. Now, when you look at sex differences in early mortality after somebody has a myocardial infarction or a heart disease, you see that the mortality rate is around 16% in women compared to 11% in men. And the statistics are actually worse when you go down the age range. Angina, which is chest pain, the prevalence is higher for women compared to men. And it's pretty interesting that the field of cardiology says that all symptoms that typically are associated with women are called atypical symptoms or atypical angina, because their typical symptomology is based essentially on a white male New England population. So, and it's also pretty instructive that more than 90% of all cardiologists and probably in excess of 96% of interventional cardiologists are male in North America and indeed in all over the OECD countries. So there's no consensus on what atypical angina, this group of symptoms that women are thought to present actually means. And when you look back at this field called nosology and go back to the 1920s and try to trace how we ended up here, you realize that cardiology has essentially treated women as non-existent. More than 46% of women in a survey conducted, the last major survey that was conducted by the AHA in 2009, said that they were unaware that heart disease was the #1 killer. So the perception, public perception also lags. Identifying women with severe angiographic disease, there are many studies early on that basically showed that the prevalence was probably a little higher in men. This is actually a much more shocking statistic. Right now, only 27% of all clinical trials in cardiology in the year 2019, only 27% of them actually represent at least some women. In fact, Congress had to step in the early 90s and mandate this to be around 30% for every trial, but we are averaging around 27% now. Is there a gender bias? And where did it come from? Now, it's very instructive to look at some of the more popular depictions of how heart disease is portrayed in the mass media. These are illustrations from Frank Netter, and when you see the image of a man who's just had a heavy meal, who just has come out of a restaurant and is experiencing chest pain. And these are some other public awareness campaigns. I was born into a family of cardiologists, so my last trip to London in 2007, I snapped this picture of this ad on a moving bus saying, this is what a heart attack and chest pain looks like, and you have to dial 999. But women and heart attacks, this is another public awareness campaign meant to show women that they can have heart disease too, except the imagery here looks more like a yoga posture. So studying angina, what can we as statisticians and machine learning people do in a reparative sense to investigate this problem? The study that we are conducting across Canada and 3 centers in the US, in Cambridge, we are recording actual conversations that doctors have with incoming patients and track them all the way to the patients getting a picture of their heart, or what's called an angiogram, when they insert a catheter and send it up to your heart to see where the block is. And when you record these conversations, you can do interesting things with ground truth data. The field of statistics that I come from is called probabilistic graphical models, and this is an example of one of the ways in which we arrange the data. Basically, if Paula is my cardiologist and I'm her patient, and I'm having a shared conversation with Paula, and we are exchanging a group of words, sentences, I'm just explaining my symptoms, and she says, tell me about your chest pain. Paula, given her training, is usually seeking to diagnose me if I have heart disease or not, whereas I am just merely interested in saying what I'm experiencing. There's a lot of research now that says that it is not that women experience atypical symptoms. Women verbally express their symptoms very differently to cardiologists than men do. In fact, in most of our trials, we have cases where a guy would come in and the doctor says, tell me about your chest pain. And the guy realizes some imagery saying from some ad, maybe an elephant walking over another man's chest, and says an elephant's walking over my chest, and is immediately rushed to the cath lab. But women basically describe their symptoms more verbosely. They say things like, I have pressing, I have slight breathlessness, but I drop my kids off at school and I've learned how to cope with it, etc. And they're usually not diagnosed appropriately. In fact, even in a place like Harvard Med School, all the teaching hospitals, some of them where I'm actually running this study, I know the ground truth of what the patient had, if the patient had heart disease or not. And when I look at the transcript of the conversation that the patient had with the cardiologist when she first went in with complaints of chest pain, I can see in the physician notes that the no CVD box has been ticked. And this is deeply troubling. So that algorithm that I showed you earlier shows that our conception of how we treat patient symptoms has essentially incorrectly followed a gendered lens. And it's not that women experience atypical symptoms more than men do. There are a lot of men who also describe their chest pain symptoms a lot like women, and they are underdiagnosed too. So this is some results from our study, and we are trying to publish this in the American Heart Association meeting this year to finally, in a very statistically rigorous way, show them that this whole notion of atypical angina is something that they have to revisit. There are a lot of symptoms that both genders experience, and a lot of symptoms are shared between both of them. This upper pain radiating on your upper arm as an atypical symptom, and the cardiologist waiting to see if that symptom appears when the woman is talking is maybe not as medically relevant in as much as it's socially mediated. These are non-chest region symptoms for both genders, and what we're seeing from a cohort of around 12,000 people is the symptoms actually are shared between the two. Now, the question now becomes, why is it that more than 80% of all diagnostic tests in cardiology, a field meant to treat heart disease, the #1 killer for women, 80% of all diagnostic testing across super specialty hospitals all across North America are done on men. I bet you if you just go to Mount Sinai or another place here and you just look up the roster of who's getting an angiogram, 80% of the patient subjects would be male. for a disease that actually kills more women. And it's something profoundly disturbing. This gender continuum is, in my opinion, a failure of the field to just look at genders in an equal way, and there has to be some kind of a restorative mindset that we have to take. Gender differences may be more of a function of language rather than biological sex differences, and no differences were observed between men and women in the seeming more biological aspects, such as non-chest location or associated symptoms. Now, I bring you back to the original slide that I started with. When we look at historical data, just as we look at an image of a distant galaxy where light has taken all this time to reach you, so you're really looking back into history, we have to correct for the distortions and the imperfections that intermediating galaxies offer us. And that's something very profound. No machine learning algorithm or reductionist computational formalism or any statistical design can change a societal lens. So, but I leave you with the maybe naive but provocative question, perhaps design for reparation can, in raising awareness and actually going beyond, in my opinion, the failed attempt at getting cardiologists to change their worldview. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Giorgia and I'm an information designer advocating for what I call data humanism, a different approach to the data world to ultimately reconnect data to what it really stands for, which is always our imperfect and messy lives. I always like to remind my designers and clients that as banal as it sounds, well, data actually does not exist. Data is an instrument that we human beings created to record reality. It's one of the tools that we have to represent reality, but it's always a placeholder for something else and never the real thing. And sometimes that can get lost. So instead of focusing on the numbers, technology, and algorithms around data, we must always focus on what data represents: people, stories, ideas. And only then data can become a powerful tool to abstract our realities according to different relevant factors every time, to analyze ideas in contexts that we normally cannot grasp. A tool actually to start new conversations as opposed to the ultimate answer to our questions. And this is why we have to reclaim a personal approach to how data is captured, analyzed, and displayed, proving that subjectivity and context play a big role, even in understanding big events and social changes, especially when data is about people. And why the term humanism? Well, in the Renaissance humanism, European intellectuals put an end to the dark medieval time by placing the human nature, instead of God, at the center of their view of the world. And I believe that something similar needs to happen with the universe of data. Now, data is apparently treated like a god, keeper of infallible truth for our present and our future. And I believe that to make data faithfully representative of our human nature, we need to start designing ways to include empathy, imperfection, and human qualities into how we process, interpret, and display it. I envision a renaissance where data is truly for everybody, but also unique to anyone. We're talking about data will mean talking about its intimate qualities and conversations that will be shaped around subjective and imperfect aspects, where data-driven design is replaced by design-driven data, because we will design the ways we will approach data depending on its unique context every time. And where ultimately, instead of using data only to become more efficient, we will all use data to become more human.
Context. The human rights of migrant populations are in jeopardy across the world right now, and too many cities are closing their doors. Our world is veering dangerously away from the norms of human dignity. The nativist mentality that once characterized the political fringe has gone mainstream, legitimizing an open racism not seen since the middle of the 20th century, to protect ourselves from infestation. The very language of a caravan is derailing us. These are individuals, not a mass, humans, not aliens, each with stories and traumas that need to be heard, each bearing rights that need to be protected. Teddy and I live and work at the border between Tijuana and San Diego, the main site of arrival for people escaping Central American violence, poverty, and the impacts of climate change. Here, geopolitics is intensely local. Fear of deportation has produced unprecedented anxiety in the immigrant communities of San Diego County. Men and women who have lived and worked and contributed in countless ways to their communities in the US are enduring terrorizing threats of the proverbial knock at the door. There are countless stories of egregious human rights violations, mass sweeps, entry and seizure without warrant, extra-legal deportation, which because of the proximity of the wall can take just a matter of minutes, detention of minors in adult facilities, the separation of migrant children from their parents. It is particularly devastating to witness the emotional impact right now on children, their fear, and the inevitable psychic internalization of their social and moral marginality. In this radical context, the prototypes for Trump's beautiful wall are a physicalization of hatred, manifesting in concrete or steel or whatever, the politics of fear that is gripping the world.
The political equator is a visualization that links border regions and activist practices across the world. We trace an imaginary line between the 30 to 38 degrees north parallel from the San Diego-Tijuana border, the main funnel of migration from Latin America into the United States, to the Strait of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean, the main route of immigrants and refugees from North Africa across fortress Europe, to the Israeli-Palestinian border that divides the Middle East, and to India, Kashmir, to North and South Korea. This is the political equator. Fonna and I believe that the convergence of geopolitical borders, climate justice, and size of poverty is a challenge of our time. Sorry, I have to return this, sorry.
What happened?
It's a danger of, I'm sorry, this, I shouldn't have touched it. It's a video that, so if you can indulge in seeing the political equator again. For us, it's a conceptual armature to actually connect global conflict with our very, very precise locality. I should leave that machine there.
Don't touch it.
So we left it at the urgency really to see the convergence, to really confront and engage the convergence of geopolitical borders, climate justice, and size of poverty.
So from the political equator, we arrived to the continental border between the United States and Mexico. This jurisdictional line bisects the 8 main watershed systems shared by both countries, a physical disruption that harms populations on both sides. We have been collecting aerial images that convey precise moments of collision between natural and political systems along the entire trajectory of the border. We have many of them, but these are really the most dramatic. For us, these are the images of broken nature. A new or thickened wall that closes these gaps will only accelerate the damage. We challenge the legitimacy of a rationalist 19th century line imposed onto complex systems and want to provoke a more ecological way of thinking about border spaces, a more restorative idea of regional interdependence.
Mexus presents the US-Mexico border as a region rather than as a line, visualizing the shared cross-border social and environmental flows framed by the binational watershed systems. unwalling this thick system of interdependencies is essential for the coexistence of divided communities. Nexus reveals what walls cannot stop: 8 watersheds, 11 indigenous tribes, protected lands, croplands, 28 urban crossings, 15 million people, and beyond. Nexus is our laboratory for political and urban creativity, reimagining the jurisdictional line as a tissue of social and spatial ecologies and seeking more expansive ideas of citizenship beyond the nation-state.
As we zoom into the westernmost corner of Nexus, we arrive in the San Diego-Tijuana River watershed. 25% is in San Diego, 75% in Tijuana. As we get closer still, we arrive at a particular juncture where an important finger of the watershed, the Laureles Canyon in Tijuana, spills across the jurisdictional wall and collides with a precious estuary in San Diego, a very important environmental zone. The Laureles Canyon is home to an informal settlement of 85,000 people and sits high above the estuary. The wall exerts a special kind of havoc here.
In this part of the world, water flows from south to north. Because of the proximity of the slum and the estuary, this means that wastewater from the slum flows northbound, carrying tons of trash and sediment into the estuary with each rainy season, harming public health on both sides. The newest section of the border wall, with its concrete dams and drains, has accelerated this process. The wall, in fact, is a self-inflicted wound, an infrastructure of insecurity.
At this very site a few years ago, we worked with Homeland Security to transform a border drain into an official port of entry for 24 hours. With passports in hand, 300 of us crossed the border drain southbound from the estuary in San Diego into the Laureles Canyon in Tijuana. Now, Homeland Security agreed to this performance, since we're just harmless artists, but they requested that Mexican immigration wait for us at the south end of the drain. As they stamped our passports in this liminal space between estuary and slum, in a mouth of the wall, as the sewage passed us by, the contradictions came alive between national security and regional environmental protection. For us, this animated a profound question. Can citizenship be organized around the shared interests and values in communities divided by a wall, rather than by nationalism and identitarian politics?
We facilitated the border drain crossing performance to raise public awareness of this critical juncture and to reopen a channel of communication between municipalities in San Diego and Tijuana. We are now summoning an unprecedented cross-border coalition of state, municipal governments, communities, and universities to develop a cross-border environmental conservancy that links the U.S. estuary and the Mexican slum into a single continuous political, social, and ecological zone like a green cross-border stitch. We're bundling in underdeveloped parcels in the slum. Each of these fragments of land will be co-curated by cross-sector coalitions to mobilize resources and curate conservation programming.
To initiate this, we designed the UCSD community stations as an instrument of community engagement and equitable regional development. The community stations link the University of California, San Diego, our campus, with neighborhoods across the border region, sharing resources and knowledges to increase community capacity for political action. The community stations are a network of public spaces in underserved immigrant communities where teaching and research and urban intervention are done collaboratively between university and community. Each community station is a partnership with an embedded grassroots organization, and together we develop long-term urban projects. And we've come to discover that the university's social capital, programmatic capacity, and economic power become leverage for our community partners as they develop their own infrastructure, housing, public space, and so on. Universities and communities can be co-developers of a more just city and a more just border region.
The first community station is located in Southeast San Diego in the immigrant community of Encanto, and it is surrounded by 6 public schools. EarthLab is a collaboration with an NGO, Groundwork San Diego, where we research K-12 environmental literacy, participatory climate action through community engagement. The local school district gave us a 4-acre vacant parcel, which we are transforming into an open-air climate action park. It is designed with energy, food, and water exhibits for hands-on experiential learning to enhance the traditional classroom science and humanities curriculum. Our claim is that while new energy technologies are essential today, they must be paired with new pedagogies and new forms of community engagement to transform norms and behaviors. In fact, we must empower youth in underserved neighborhoods to be agents of climate action. The UCSD Casa Station is located in the border neighborhood of San Isidro. With the nonprofit organization Casa Familiar, we research social justice in the city. We research affordable housing, public space, immigration, and cross-border citizenship. Our physical station here manifests a strategic relationship between social housing and public space that educates. We began construction of this project 2 months ago, where neighborhood youth access higher education through arts and cultural spaces and activities. Immigrant neighborhoods we maintain are sites of cultural productivity and the laboratories for new civic infrastructure. And our final community station across the border in Tijuana is located in the informal settlements of Laureles Canyon that Fonna mentioned earlier. With the NGO Divina Providencia, we research informal urbanization, raise awareness of cross-border environmental assets, and cultivate regional interdependence and empathy. The station is designed as a flexible space for collaborative education and community development.
We believe that children are the cross-border citizens of the future. Education opens hearts and minds, an education that teaches empathy and a more expansive idea of well-being, that the survival of the individual depends on the health of the collective. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll wait on the side.
We already know that cities are inherently sustainable. People walk, people use mass transit, they live in apartments that heat and cool each other, and so we should double down on that. And in terms of prosperity, we know that cities, because of all of the human serendipity, generate a huge amount of economic activity, and the real challenge is finding policies that can make that economic activity more shared. But when I hear the word restorative, what fascinates me is the idea that the technologies about which there's so much hype, autonomous vehicles, tall timber construction, that what's exciting isn't the technology itself, but the context it could create. So could we bring back streets without curbs? Could we build buildings again that had a much more material and sensual quality? So rather than this 20th century idea of technology and humanity being at odds, that technology in the future city could bring back a desperately needed sense of humanity.
I would like to bring Karthik and Heather up on stage also. Thank you for these great contributions. Oh, sit next to me, Karthik. So it was really a great session and a great keynote, Ursula, and marked by this kind of like roller coaster between apparent cynicism and apparent optimism, pragmatism. And it's very fun because in the course of preparing this exhibition, the other curators and I have been called at different times pessimist, skeptical, optimist. And it's very funny because in the end, it doesn't really matter, right? It's not really what that is about. But I find really interesting looking for the red thread in all these different presentations because sometimes also with my colleagues, we act in an almost instinctive way. We like what you all have to say. It kind of resonates with the idea, with the strange mix that we're trying to make, and we try to make sense of it by calling you here. But by listening to each other, what have you learned anything new about the work that you are all developing? Because, you both talked about communication. There was like a real parallel discussion about communication between you and what Karthik was saying, for instance.
Well, I can just begin by picking up on this topic of pessimistic, well, what I would call pessimistic optimism, which, at least from the vantage point of our work, we always say we must begin any endeavor, particularly in terms of our urban or pedagogical interventions, by really engaging urban conflict as a creative tool. So in a sense, obviously we are all optimists because we are trying to be change agents. We must, primarily at this moment. But I think that the point of departure, for us at least, is always a dialectical one, where politics really frame, ultimately, the strategies and so on. So confronting and visualizing and naming the problem for what it is, I think, is a fundamental point of departure for designers. If I can just pick up on one aspect, which obviously has to do with new forms of public communication that can democratize knowledge, that can enable the transference of knowledge from institutions to publics and back. I think that's essential, in terms of what we heard today, but also through the keynote presentation and your work, I think, which is something that we also investigate through our community stations, is how indigenous traditions, knowledges, must be brought back to really reorganize our epistemological lineages, because knowledges that are siloed become another instrument of power. And I think that this idea, in terms of the schools that we are engaging through our community stations, there is always this question: can traditional indigenous knowledge be brought back, but not as a metaphor, but as a set of practices that can enter really into the currency of our moment?
Just to follow up quickly, and Ursula's focus on polar bears was very interesting from the perspective of your question, because more and more we're seeing polar bears used in the climate communication conversation, that actually telling people that polar bears are in danger are not actually going to change their local behavior. That polar bears seem far away, they seem diffuse, there's nothing we can do about it, it's not relevant. And so all the climate communicators now are saying, don't talk about polar bears, talk about the block that you live on.
The passenger pigeon.
Right? Yeah. And so it's a really interesting question about how to navigate the trauma of impending doom with the kind of, the daily tempo of people's lives, and how to make something dramatic seem very relevant and possible and optimistic in a local sense.
And you're talking about naming. Did you want to say something? Because I'm gonna. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
What really stood out for me is how language that's reflective of a broader set of thinking can get really ossified. I think that was what really stood out for me in Ursula's talk about the narratives that come out of just using polar bears. And colonialism connected with climate change as not something that can change. What I find in my own work is that over and over again, the language that people use to describe these kinds of constructs like atypical angina, they are so ossified, and it's very difficult to dislodge them once they become the norm. And it probably takes a machine learning person or a statistician trying to change atypical angina. The question that I always ask is, what is the rest of the cardiology community doing? Because this problem has been around, and they know that more women are dying compared to men, and 80% of all their diagnostic tests are done on men. And they still go with the notion of atypical angina. So this ossification, I think, is what really stood out for me.
Well, it's interesting because the reason there was something manipulative about us putting the video by Giorgia Lupi right after you. Actually, with Karthik, we're trying to push Karthik to realize a Heimlich maneuver-like poster together with an illustrator to be distributed in ERs and cardiology centers to teach people to teach doctors how to ask the questions. So in a way, having Giorgia afterwards, who's a visualization designer, was a way to suggest that maybe design can help change language too, which is something that we aspire to. But Heather, it's funny, all of us, Ala, Erica, and Samantha and I, we all reacted to your sitting with brokenness theme, which is very powerful. And also, now you were saying that naming the problem is part of, not the solution, but at least of the process that humans have to go through. So here I would like to read you a question from Ala. You mentioned the importance of realizing that some of the changes humans have caused are in fact irreparable, and that we need to start familiarizing ourselves with sitting with brokenness. In fact, throughout the process of creating the checklist for broken nature, we had lengthy conversations about what qualifies as reparations by design. And one of our choices was to also show projects that precisely speak to this brokenness without necessarily presenting solutions. But do you believe that this act of making the brokenness apparent and familiarizing people with it and make them live with it is in itself a reparative act?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just also to sort of say, to pick up on some of the question earlier, Karthik, what I really appreciated about the beginning of your presentation about the bending of light is that I think that in a way that's also what I was trying to speak to, right, is that like we're caught in this question of the bending of light, right, in the sense that our history is still deeply informed, the past that is not past, that is actually present, right, and that in this part of the world there's so much violence that informs and continues to inform all of our politics and all of the ways in which we can move forward, as I think that your work so beautifully illustrates and also really tries to work with and against at the same time. And I think that that's precisely the kind of the conjuncture, right, is this kind of question of reparations. Clearly there's always this sort of need to do something, right? And yet at the same time, I think that, what I've learned so much from many of my Indigenous colleagues, and especially from Kyle White's work, is that things like colonialism things like climate change are not new, right? That climate change, in fact, is this 500-year-old, at least 500-year-old process, right? And so if we think about it in those terms, if we think about the ends of the world, so many peoples have already lived through the ends of the world, right? And so if we've already lived through the ends of the world, then I think the question really both gains urgency but also loses urgency at the same time. Like there's this sort of interesting shift in terms of temporal scales that I think allows us to then both sit with our histories in ways that I think are really necessary because we're so quick to move on. I was listening to a beautiful podcast with Marlon James yesterday, and he was talking about how, we say that we really talk about slavery a lot in this country, but yet we actually don't, right? We don't really grapple with what that means in a public way very often, for example. And so I think that, really sitting with those histories is deeply necessary for any kind of project of reparations, and to really shift the kinds of political dynamics about who actually has power and who doesn't, because what we're caught in is precisely the kind of repetition that you guys so beautifully were showing at the beginning of your
Karthik, you wanted to say something? I saw that you were nodding.
So when I first decided to do this project, a very famous cardiologist in Cambridge said to me, here's a data set from the 1970s of all the patients that have come in. Why don't we just do a predictive algorithm that says who is more likely to have heart disease based on what is there? Now, at that point in time, if I had just followed that advice, it would basically end up with something like a man comes in, higher risk of heart disease. A woman comes in, no risk, just because of how biased and imbalanced the data is. But to your question of, when you sit down with the brokenness, is that reparative in itself? I spend a lot of time in the cardiology cath labs where a lot of emergency procedures are done to save people who are actually have a block that's cutting off blood supply to their heart, having a heart attack. And I will never forget this one incident where we had a roster of 5 patients, and they decided to cancel the third one, saying, we'll do you tomorrow. They wheeled in a 40-year-old African-American lady, and she was clearly having a heart attack. They were trying to do an emergency angioplasty, and she didn't survive. I actually literally watched her pass away on the table. The nurses in the cath lab are mostly women. And this one nurse that is about to retire came up to me, grabbed my hand, and said, I'm so glad you watched this, even if this is really hard for you, because you should know that amongst us female nurses, and I've been here since 20 years, we call